volunteer guide here at the Shrine of Remembrance. I've done this for going on for 5 years, and it comes about because my lifelong interest in military history. So when the opportunity came to volunteer, I put my hand up rather quickly, and as a consequence of that, my knowledge of the Great War has been enhanced considerably since I've been here. I must confess, most of my knowledge was in the Second World War. Shrine has been brought about by the Great War itself, the war to end all wars. And I explained to our visitors here that when the Great War was over in 1918 and the survivors of that conflict arrived back in Australia in 1919, those who did survive, there was this feeling around the country, nationally, that it should never be forgotten what had happened. Because some 360,000 Australians went to the Great War, and sadly almost 62,000 of them didn't return. Some 16% of those who went were killed, never to return. I guess it was a huge event because from an initial force of 20,000, which formed the first part of the Australian Imperial Expeditionary Force in 1914, that grew to almost 440,000 volunteers by 1918. As I said before, 320,000 did go, and the most horrific losses were suffered by the state of Victoria. Out of around 100,000 going, 20% of them never came back, almost 20,000. It was the state of Victoria suffered the greatest losses for some reason or other. I tell people that on a general basis, for every 5 that went to the Great War, 2 were killed, never to return. 2 were severely wounded, left incapacitated in one way or another. Maybe loss of limbs, fingers, hands, feet, legs, arms, loss of eyesight, hearing, and very bad lungs as a result of gassing. 2 dead, 2 came back with severe disabilities, and the other one came back traumatised. Now let me correct that. 1 killed, 2 severely wounded, and 2 coming back severely traumatised by what had happened. The fighting stopped on the 11th of November 1918 after the Germans put their hand up and requested an armistice. The armistice was agreed to, and it was signed at 6 o'clock in the morning of that day, and it took some 5 hours to stop fighting. Fighting ceased around about 11 o'clock when the guns actually felt silent. The battlefield on the Western Front was quite amazing in terms of its size. I tell people that the battlefield, which posing trench lines, roughly half a mile to a mile apart, 800 metres to 1600 metres apart, ranged from the English Channel, Belgium and France, all the way to the Swiss border, which is the equivalent of Melbourne to Adelaide. It seems like an enormous distance, and it was, where they'd been fighting and shooting each other and shelling each other for 4 years. And by the winter time of 1918, the battlefield was like a moonscape. There was virtually no buildings left. They were all destroyed, the villages all along that line. Most of the trees were all gone. It was a sea of mud and devastation, and it must have been something really to behold. But that winter of that year was one of the coldest winters on record. And not only did they suffer because of the fighting, they suffered because of the weather as well. So eventually the war finished, and the war actually didn't finish officially until June of 1919. Soon after, when fighting finished in November 1918, the following year, I think it was in February, the Paris Peace Conference was held, where the winners, the Allies, discussed what was going to happen to the losers, the Germans, Austrians, and the Turks. And that went on for some time, and eventually it was concluded upon the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919 at Louis XIV's palace in the famous Hall of Mirrors. And where Marshal Foch, who was the Allies' commanding officer, made the comment that the whole, Marshal Foch made the comment after this treaty was signed. You're probably still here. Yeah.
Okay, it's not too bad.
That the treaty was just a nonsense, and he made the statement, "This treaty will not last 20 years." Well, he was pretty accurate actually. It lasted 21 years, because soon after that, the reparations placed upon the German nation were quite severe. They were forced to pay huge sums of money to the Allies for what they'd caused. They were restricted on the type of armed service forces they could have, and a lot of other restrictions. Well, during that time, they had the great influenza epidemic that swept a lot of the world, and then soon after that, the Great Depression. So during that time, there was a lot of unrest in Germany in respect to the governments, and there was political problems, communists and agitators, and that saw the emergence of the National Socialist Workers' Party, Adolf Hitler, and their rise to power. And we know what happened after that. The war broke out again on the 1st of September 1939. So the shrine, well, as I said, it affected the building of the shrine was brought about by the effect of the Great War. There wasn't a town, city, village, hamlet within Australia that wasn't affected by it. They knew somebody or that had been killed or wounded or what have you in the Great War, and this was this great feeling that they had to do something about it, so that it was never forgotten. So early in 1919, our committee was formed here in Melbourne. Lieutenant John Monash was on the committee to come up with an idea, a notion or a project to commemorate the loss of the Great War. And the competition was open to Australian, New Zealand and British-born architects and artists to come up with something. Well, they got all these entries of all sort of weird and wonderful things, including towers and arches and you name it. But the winning entry was submitted by two young Melbourne architects who were survivors of the Great War, Wardrope and Hudson. And their winning entry was a Shrine of Remembrance, what you see today. So they win the prize. This is what's going to happen. Then the search went on where it would be built. Some 20 sites were considered, including Royal Park in Melbourne. But the site that was eventually chosen was this Ball Hill where we are today in St Kilda Road. There was nothing here at that time, and that was the site. Well, the money was raised to build this building in a matter of weeks, and they raised £250,000, which in early 1920, somewhere around there, I think 1919, 1920. And so that was a considerable amount of money to raise, mostly by donations. So they've got the money, they've got the site, they've got the design. It's all going to happen, but it didn't. Controversy raged. And the controversy was fanned by none other than Keith Murdoch, the father of President Rupert Murdoch and News Limited. Murdoch, for some reason or other, we're not quite sure, but it might have been because Monash was Jewish. Murdoch was opposed to the building of the shrine, and he used his newspapers to have that decision overturned. And eventually, the forerunner of the modern RSL, which was then called the Returned Sailors Soldiers Imperial League of Australia, agreed, and the shrine wasn't going to happen. What was going to happen was Anzac Square. They were going to demolish a lot of buildings actually in Spring Street facing Parliament House, in the area of Collins and top of Burke Street, and Lonsdale Street and create a square there and call it Anzac Square or Anzac Park, and that's what was going to happen. But many of the veterans, those survivors, weren't happy about that. See, Monash wasn't too happy about it because he was on the committee to select this particular thing. And I guess agitators trying to get the shrine built, and there was agitators trying to do the opposite. However, nothing's happened. It's still 1926, nothing's happened. But in 1927, we had a visit, royal visit to Melbourne, indeed Australia. The Duke and Duchess of York, later become King George VI, came to Australia on the instruction of his father to the Federal Parliament in Canberra, the new Parliament building in Canberra. He was in Melbourne, so there was a lot to do in Melbourne at the time. It was a meeting of the RSL, or the Returned Sailors, Soldiers, Imperial League of Australia, in Collins Street at their headquarters, and that was held Anzac Day Eve 1927. And the guest of honour was Stanley Bruce, the Prime Minister of Australia. Lieutenant General Sir John Monash was there, and they'd assembled some 32 recipients of the Victoria Cross there at the meeting as well. Now, prior to this meeting, one of the VC recipients, his name was Donovan Joint, he was agitating that the shrine should be built, and he went about that evening and enlisting the help of other Victoria Cross recipients to make a demonstration in favour of the shrine at that particular meeting. He spoke with Monash and urged Monash to make a public statement that evening, and Monash agreed. In Monash's welcoming address to the Prime Minister, he included at the end of it his reasons why the shrine should be built. Well, when he said that, the VC recipients all leapt to their feet and applauded wildly and clapped and cheered and encouraged Monash, and the RSL people were taken aback. They were dumbfounded. They didn't think or realise there was so much support for the shrine. So later that evening, I understand that Monash was invited to attend their conference, which was going to happen a week or so later. And Monash did attend, and as a result of that attendance, they reversed their decision. Instead of the Anzac Park, Anzac Square, they went back and was in support of the Shrine of Remembrance. So that's how it came about. It was a very close call indeed. The foundation stone was laid on Remembrance Day 1927. Work commenced in early 1928. It was completed in 1934, officially opened on Remembrance Day 1934, where Sovereign of the Day George V sent his third son to Australia, His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester, Prince Henry, and he performed the opening ceremony here on the south door entrance and steps. There was some 300,000 people here that day. It was quite an occasion in Melbourne that day. The reason why they had it on the south steps, because on the north steps here, the carving in the above the pillars on the north, I'll think of the name in a moment, is the call to arms, the mother country calling to arms. But on the south side, it's the homecoming with the angel, and they thought it was far more appropriate to have it on that side. So we have this Shrine of Remembrance for the Great War, and as a consequence of the Second World War, they had to come up with an idea to remember that as well. So the World War II Memorial Forecourt was built in the shape of a cross with the cenotaph, the eternal flame, and the three flagpoles of equal height. And that was officially opened by the visit of the first reigning monarch to this country, Elizabeth II. Her father, George VI, had died in February of 1952. The coronation was in June of 53. She came to Australia in 1954, and on the 28th of February she was here, and she opened the World War II Memorial Forecourt and lit the eternal flame for the very first time. But she's been here a number of occasions since. So that's the history of the two main features of the shrine, but there's other features, of course. There's subsequent memorials to the Korean War, the Malaysian conflict, Vietnam, and subsequent like Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Our park is bordered by Birdwood Avenue, named after General Birdwood. He was the first commanding officer of the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. He was from the British India Army to command the Australians and the New Zealanders. So that Birdwood Avenue is named after him. The park is in sort of a triangle: Birdwood Avenue, St Kilda Road, and rear is Dallas Brooks Drive, which was named after a former governor of Victoria, Dallas Brooks. There's some 400 trees in our park. Each tree has a bronze plaque at the foot of it, which remembers a unit, maybe battalion, regiment, division, or group, association, women and men, and services are held at all these trees from time to time by people who are involved with those organisations. No one person can be honoured at the shrine. It's for everybody. The ambulatory surrounding the sanctuary, 40 books of remembrance are there. So if you have a relative that served in the Great War, listed in Victoria, his or her name is recorded in those books in alphabetical sequence without rank. Everybody is equal. So if you're visiting the shrine and wish to see your relative's name, we get the custodian on duty to come with his key and his white gloves. He opens the casket where the books are, each book, and turns to the page where you're allowed to see it and allowed to photograph it. So that task took 3 years to complete. 8 calligraphers, 6 men and 2 women. It's quite a task, and it's most beautifully presented with pages of illustration as well. The sanctuary is probably the heart of the shrine. It's where the Stone of Remembrance is, which is the symbolic gravestone of all those who didn't return. As I said, 62,000 were killed in the Great War. Only 2 of the war dead will return. General Bridges, who was the commanding officer of the 1st Australian Division of the AIEF, he was mortally wounded at Gallipoli. His body was returned for a state funeral in Melbourne, I guess because he was a general. He was later buried in Canberra on the grounds of Duntroon, the Royal Military College, because he was the first commandant. The second of the war dead from the Great War wasn't returned until 1993. An unknown soldier from France to be entombed in the tomb of the unknown soldier in Canberra. And on that day, the Prime Minister of the day, Paul Keating, gave the most magnificent speech. So only 2 from the Great War were returned to this country. Incidentally, 136,000 horses went to the Great War from Australia. Only 1 returned. That was the horse of General Bridges, was returned to take part in his funeral. Second World War, well, the war broke out on the 1st of September 1939, but by war's end in 1945, out of a population of 7 million, 1 million Australians were in the armed services. And sadly, 39,000 Australians killed in the Second World War. None of the war dead from the Second World War returned to this country, none. It wasn't until Vietnam we returned our war dead. Korea, none were returned, sadly. It wasn't until Vietnam. So it has a great history, the shrine. Getting back to the sanctuary and the Ray of Light, we replicate what happens here on Remembrance Day. Every half an hour and every hour we have a small service which only takes 3 minutes, where we have a projector project the light across the stone, together with the last post is played and the ode is recited. Now on Remembrance Day, the sunlight crosses the stone. Just before 11 o'clock, the sun appears through the aperture in the north ceiling of the sanctuary, and from when it first appears, the size of a saucer plate, from when it first appears, touches the plinth surrounding the Stone of Remembrance, to when it disappears on the opposite side, takes 11 minutes and 48 seconds to cross the stone before it appears and disappears. But precisely 11 o'clock, it's on the words love on the inscription. Love. So that's quite a unique feature of the sanctuary. But there's lots of other features with the shrine. I guess the eternal flame, which symbolises eternal life, that they're always remembered. Cenotaph out the front with the top of the cenotaph is the serviceman burying a dead comrade. 3 flagpoles of equal height, which dictates the protocol of which way the flag should be flown. Left-hand side is the flag of Australia. In the middle, we fly the state flag of Victoria, and on the right-hand side, we rotate that flag for various reasons. Might be a unit flag, or most Fridays we fly the flag of the city of Melbourne. It's a great place to visit, but it's been, as I said, brought about by the Great War, the war to end all wars. It was a devastating event. Some 8 million people lost their lives in it as a result of the Great War. It was this event that broke out that had catastrophic results, and it affected an entire nation, and it brought about the legend, of course, of the Anzacs. And I explained to people, Anzac, Australian New Zealand Army Corps, how they came about is because when we travelled to the Great War, the first convoy, with some 20,000 Australians, young men, with 8,000 horses, in 28 ships, coal-burning, slow ships, which all assembled at King George Sound, Albany, Western Australia in October 1914, where they waited for the 10 ships coming from New Zealand with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force with 8,000 young New Zealand men. So we have this grand sight, 38 ships protected by 4 warships. They assembled there and then they set forth on their journey to Europe, but they didn't get there. The High Commissioner in London, Sir George Reid, cabled Australia and said, Australian government said, you should not allow the troops to arrive in England. The weather's too bad, the accommodations is not suitable. They should be offloaded somewhere else and complete their training. So that was where the decision came from, to land them in Egypt. And as a result of that, we got involved in the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. The initial force of 20,000, that was recruited in a matter of weeks, because the recruiters were going all over the nation telling the young men it was going to be a great adventure. The war will be over in no time. You mightn't even get to fight. It might be over before you get there. But sadly, it wasn't. So, and there was a lot of other attractions. Was the uniform, especially the light horse uniform. That was something. Behold, the men of the light horse. But yeah, well, when you think about it, those days, most of the young people of Australia hadn't travelled anywhere. Many of them hadn't even seen the ocean, let alone travel. And they were going to be paid the princely sum of 6 shillings a day, which was a sizable amount of money, I might add. When you think that the British Army, their people only got 1 shilling a day. So it was pretty impressive. And we were very much, 1914, very much pro-British. We just, Federation of Australia only happened in 1901, so we're pretty well British people. So I guess there was a fair sentiment in regard to the mother country. I've seen lots and lots of evidence where men put their age down to make sure they would be included, and men put their age up. Jim Martin was the youngest. He was only a boy, really, 14 years and 3 months he enlisted at, and he was allowed to go. Sadly, at 14 years and 3 months, you see his photograph, he definitely looks very boyish. He went, and he was in Gallipoli, where he contracted enteric fever, sort of I guess like a typhoid. He was very ill. They put him on a hospital ship and died on the hospital ship at the age of 14 years and 9 months. Never got home. So he has no known grave. So incidentally, of the 62,000 of the Great War, 16% of them have no known grave. They're either never found, buried at sea, or resting in a grave marked unknown. That's quite common when you go to places like Gallipoli. 8,000 Australians were killed at Gallipoli, almost 3,000 New Zealanders. But when you walk the cemeteries of Gallipoli, there is not 11,000 buried there, I can assure you. So, and many of those who are buried there, their notation on their tombstone simply says, believed to be buried here. It's quite chilling when you read it. Believed to be buried here. So I have this great association, military history, I guess, and going to Gallipoli, I spent a lot more time studying Gallipoli, and it was a tragic event. From the landing on the 25th of April to the final evacuation on the 20th of December the same year. Horrific conditions, from arriving in springtime, suffering the heat of summer, during the rains of the autumn and the snows of the winter at Gallipoli in Turkey. Terrible conditions, poor food and shelter and everything else. The British thought it was going to be a huge success. They thought they were going to overpower the Turks quite easily and be in Constantinople, now Istanbul, in a matter of weeks. But that didn't happen. Went into a stalemate situation, and at Gallipoli, and because of that, a few factors came into play, and the most important was there was no water at Gallipoli. High summer there, which is extremely hot, I can assure you. Australians were receiving only equivalent 1 litre of water a day. So they had to, that was their water ration for the day. And you think about it, pretty tough. You had to wash yourself or wash your clothes. It had to be done in the Aegean Sea. And it had to be done at night because you could well find yourself shot or killed.